For those of you who know me, and some of you who've seen me give some of this talk before, this is going to be a really difficult thing for me to hold to a podium because I generally like to pace back and forth across the whole room. So if you see me wandering in front of the screen, I'll probably be looking for Kim to give me a little bit of direction to get back to my home base over here. Some of the things that I want to share with you today, I'm particularly looking at some of the numbers, and I appreciate Shane or talking about getting more data in front of you because I kind of geek out on that kind of stuff. So he kind of set the stage for getting some more information out. As we look at some of this information, though, I do want to point out you may see some differences in the percentages or attainment rates or things like that. And part of that's because of different methodologies. Part of it is different data sources, and particularly what I want to share with you is because it's part of a different population. We're looking very specifically at the pipeline of students who are leaving K-12 and then entering into higher ed and or the workforce. So it's a little bit of a different slice of what we've been looking at so far. But I think all of us know that it's hard to have this conversation in any real sense when there are a lot of conflicting data points that tell us how wonderful things are. When we have a highest graduation rate in the country, we have the second lowest unemployment rate. U.S. News and World Report listed Iowa as the best place to live. So it's kind of hard to gain some momentum around some of these components when we have so many things looking us in the face that are telling us, but there's not really a problem. We do have a high graduation rate. But when we start looking at attainment rates beyond that, when we look at four-year degree earners, for students who are leaving high school and going right into college, we see quite a bit of a drop-off in attainment, quite frankly. And you'll see that there on the screen. And in fact, the gap between those who earn a high school diploma and those who earn a four-year degree, that population of students is actually the 45th highest gap in the country. So we're not doing as well in that area. And the same thing goes true for two-year degree attainments. Which is really, this is kind of a startling statistic for me, is that so few students earn an award from a two-year degree institution. And in Iowa, that's primarily our community college system. We're second in the nation at 13%. So we are leading the attainment piece of that, but we're still getting very, very few people across the stage on that game. And I think, as Director Townsend mentioned earlier, this is where the part of the pipeline that we need to start plugging up a little bit more directly. So when you look at that, what that means for us from a workforce development or an economic development standpoint is we have a large workforce who has a high school diploma and no more, and we've heard from a couple of speakers already how problematic that can be. So several years ago, and I want to say this started before 2014, but I came onto it in 2014, the state of Iowa set out to identify what does it really mean to be college and career ready. There were a number of groups who were tackling this question, and the Department of Ed brought together a convening that looked very similar to this one. There were business and industry folks, there were local officials, elected officials, higher ed, K-12, all across the spectrum, and went through a series of events where we tried to identify, so what exactly does it mean for a student to leave high school and be ready to enter higher ed in the workforce? And you'll notice that there are 4 buckets up there, and one of them is about academic understanding, one of them is about transition skills, one of them speaks more to cognitive strategies, and one of them speaks more to self-understanding and engagement. Primarily in K-12 education, we've lived in that bucket 1. We've lived in academic preparation. And up until this definition came out, the only way Iowa defined what it meant to be college ready was through an ACT score. Employers in the audience, I would wonder how many of you are asking your people during an interview how they did on the ACT. I'm hoping that most of you don't do that. But it really is kind of talks about what it is that we said was making people ready, and then what were we intending to in school? We were really, to a great degree, ignoring a lot of those other buckets. One of the strategies of Future Ready Iowa talks a lot about career counseling and what the role of that is. And having been a former high school, middle school counselor, knowing how critically important that was, we need to make sure that we're providing the schools with the resources they need to do that well and to do that adequately throughout the system. So this is a chart that's from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and what it highlights for you here is pretty self-explanatory information. It talks about the education attainment rate, what it means for your unemployment chances, and what it means for your income over time. That 725 figure there represents something in education that's very near and dear to our hearts. It's the way we categorize students. It is the benchmark for students qualifying for free and reduced lunch. And if you'll notice on that chart, it kind of fits neatly between high school diploma completers are below that threshold, and those who go on and pursue something after high school are above that. So we can pretty accurately predict in a community the education attainment rate and the free and reduced lunch rates in the future. Those are resource-intensive programs to try to support, and we know that. One of the things that I also want to make sure that I highlight on this slide is that you see there's a pretty big jump between associate's and bachelor's degree. And I think one of the inherent dangers when we have this conversation is that we promote the idea that the four-year college degree is worth more. And I don't necessarily mean just in academic or financial worth, I mean in societal prestige value. People often go to work and they want to brag about their son or daughter who's going to law school, who's going to med school, and they should be equally proud and have as much prestige for their child who chooses to go into the trades and finds a fulfilling career in life, lifelong sustainable wage for that as well. But what's interesting about that is if you know anything about student loan debt, Iowa sits comfortably at about $30,000 in average student loan debt for a four-year graduate, and just under $7,000 for students who earn a two-year degree or less. If you know how those payments work, if you are getting a four-year degree, the return on investment is there, but the return on investment is pretty darn equal to what it is to get a one or two-year degree or certificate. So that's something to keep in mind when we don't just look at necessarily the money, but how much did it cost you to get there? And that's an important factor to consider. So regionally within our AEA, and Bill described what that area holds, is we've been sharing this chart specifically with schools for quite some time. And because what it does is it shows us where some opportunity gaps are, and I want to make sure that I address how to look at this. But essentially this is for every 100 students, known as a cohort in education, who enters a grade level together. So if you follow me on the left where it says 2008, in that grade, well, in that year, those students all started high school together in 2004. 4 years later, 80 of them graduated. The next line in red talks about intentions, and Iowa is one of the few states that collects at the student level their post-secondary plan at graduation. So at the end of senior year, and having been a counselor, I've seen how this works. There's a piece of paper on your chair at graduation or graduation rehearsal, and they ask you what your plan is for next year, and they've got to answer one of 9 categories. Most of those categories have something to do with going into education, workforce, or training. So you'll see there that there's a lot of students who graduate who don't even have a plan to what they're going to do next. Short of living in mom and dad's basement, that really seems to be the only plan that so far that we've seen them come back and respond with. So that's a pretty significant gap. We talked about career counseling being one of those pieces. How are those students leaving high school with absolutely no idea what they want to do next? And I've said this analogy a lot of times in the past. You wouldn't walk through an 8th grade middle school and ask all the 8th graders, have you thought about going to high school? I think you'd be really good at high school. My parents went to high school. Like, that just sounds silly when we say that, and we do that to every high school student about what their options are after high school. We almost make it seem as though something after high school isn't necessary and it's optional, and we have to send the message that it's critically necessary and expected by everybody in the community, your parents, your aunts and uncles, your parents' friends, your school, your community. So we see that gap in attrition there from graduation to intention, and then you'll also see there's another gap in there from intention to enrollment. Students who say they're going to go, but then 3 months later they don't actually show up on campus. They've said they're going to go, and for a variety of reasons, and I'll talk about what some of those are in just a little bit, you see another drop-off. From there on, from enrollment to persistence, those are students who started school and a year later were still in, but hadn't yet finished. And we do have a pretty high rate of students who persist. If you were to actually take those numbers and pull them together, about 85% of Iowans who start stick with it and go back for a second year. Our 4-year college completion rate is one of the highest 4-year college completion rates in the country of those who start. So if we get them there, they generally tend to be pretty successful. And the next piece that's on there is the completion rate. So what we've looked at now is those 100 students who started 9th grade together, 4 years of high school, 6 years after they graduated, 10 years later, 40 of those original 100 in our AEA have completed some form of post-secondary education attainment credential. That includes 1 and 2 year certificates, 4-year degrees, and beyond. What's not present in that data point are students who enlist in the military, students who go into registered apprenticeships. Those are data points that we are very aggressively trying to get into our data set. The Department of Defense doesn't want us to know who's enlisting, probably for some obvious reasons, but we are working on the registered apprenticeship component. So you can see there's a lot of opportunities there within the community, within K-12 and within higher ed and workforce to narrow some of these gaps. And I think that's the challenging work. Here's what's startling though. Bill mentioned that we are an agency that is really focused on equity. So this is great that this is everybody. But I'm going to show you some numbers that I hope I hear some gasps and audible jaws dropping on the table. Because here's what happens for the students who experience poverty, students who are on free and reduced lunch in our schools. Look how much lower their levels of attainment are across the board, from graduation to intent, to enrollment, to persistence, to completion. Now, if I were to go back, you would see generally the charts kind of look the same, but all of the lines have dropped about 15 percentage points across the board. So that's a population that we know is at high risk. We also have the race ethnicity gap. So in our region, and this is not uncommon in Iowa, we have some data redaction rules that require us to group folks together, which, you know, from an equity standpoint is a hard one for me to swallow because I don't like lumping people together. But we have a lot of schools that don't have enough students who make up a specific population to be able to report out on them. So this chart shows students in our AEA who are identified as Black, Hispanic, or 2 or more races. And again, you'll see the same levels of attrition, but the overall bars are about 10 percentage points lower. And finally, our students with disabilities. And you can see that those ones have experienced a greater degree of attrition between many of them leave high school without an articulated plan to a much greater degree than all students do. Interestingly though, if you look at the enrollment to persistence to completion, their bars are tighter than any other category. So we know that it's not because special ed students aren't capable, because those who go are much more likely to be persisters and completers compared to the average. And there's probably something about those students that's worth finding out. From an intervention standpoint, one of the things that we try to highlight too, and this tends to be a pretty blunt comment, but I look at those last 3 slides and I work with schools and I say, so when did you know that these students were Black or Hispanic? When did you know that they struggled with learning? And when did you know that their family may have been in poverty? Because I'm willing to bet the farm that you didn't know that when they were in 11th grade. You probably knew some of those factors early in elementary school, and we do have to provide levels of support and intervention to meet people where they're at and provide the needs, support the needs that they have. So as I move along outside of what's happened in our AEA, with the data, Kim and I have had quite a number of conversations about, so what are we doing to fix that? Because we certainly can't just look at the problem and admire it. One of the things that we were fortunate enough to have in our region because of the data set that we have is the ability to engage with some partnership with Iowa College Aid and the Carver Trust Foundation to publish a research study that just came out, I believe, maybe a week ago, and it was on the impact of Gear Up on student enrollment in particular.